Massachusetts. Are you in the Boston area?
North of Boston.
Okay. Okay. Awesome, man. Well, Don, man, I've been so excited to talk to you today. As I got your book, I got it here, The Immortals of American Boxing. Man, I was going through and I was thinking of moments of just growing up and watching certain fights. I didn't get to see Ali, and I kind of saw the tail end of Mike Tyson. But I remember the Lennox Lewis fight with him in Memphis as a kid when Lennox won. Obviously, I've grown up with like Pacquiao and Money Mayweather, and it's pretty cool, man. You have a system of how you, I guess, nominated your immortals. Because I was going through some of your honorable mentions, and I was like, dang, there's some arguments here. But no, man, super interested just to hear your story on just your interest of boxing and how you put this book together.
Well, I've written for the Ring magazine for a long time, maybe 20 years, I think. And I was approached by the publisher of this book from the Gelding Street Press. They're an Australian group. And they had put out some really nice books about Australian sports, rugby, surfing, horse racing, motor car type sports. They had done a lot of nice books and they wanted to branch out into American sports. They were approached by Simon and Schuster, which is a big American company,
Yeah.
and Simon and Schuster said, "Do an American sport. We'll put you in American bookstores and we'll distribute." So one of the guys in Australia knew about me. He'd read one of my other books, and I think he may have heard me on another podcast. And he thought, well, there's the guy who can write our book for us, you know. And he contacted me, and he made the proposal that they had already done the Immortals of soccer, the Immortals of rugby. He said they wanted to do the Immortals of American Boxing. And he asked me if I was interested. And believe it or not, my first instinct was, there are a lot of history books out there already.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I could really do anything different. What was I going to bring to it? But
Yeah.
after maybe a day of thinking about it, I thought, why not? I have all those old books, I grew up reading them. That was how I learned a lot. And I thought, well, here's my opportunity. I'll put my spin on it. It was the kind of book that I would have liked when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And that was part of it. And I thought they did a really nice job with it. It's a great gift book. I feel like I'm on the Home Shopping Network. It's a great gift. It's Father's Day, Christmas. You've got an older fella in the family who likes the fights. This
Yeah.
might be great for him. Or, like I said, if you're a young fan and you're curious about the history, things didn't start with Manny Pacquiao and Mike Tyson. They've got a long lineage going back more than a century,
Yeah.
And I think for those who are curious, it's a nice, sort of a nice primer to have to
Yeah.
name some of the great American fighters. I'm glad I only had to focus on Americans, because if I had to include Mexican fighters and British
Yeah.
fighters and Russian fighters, the book would have been this big, and I'd still be working on it. I would have never finished.
Yeah. No, well, it's certainly it's definitely like you said, it's one of those books like well, even now, but I was thinking like as a kid where I could go through and kind of like quickly see pictures of icons, I'm a big football fan, so I'm thinking of books like that where I'd see, old quarterbacks, Johnny Unitas, Dan Marino, and then flipping through and learning about them. That's exactly how this book is structured
Yeah.
with the great boxers. You go through and you can kind of kick back just for a little bit and just catch a glimpse of a highlight or a memory or something that you've heard someone talk about.
Yeah, if a younger guy buys this book, or a younger woman or whoever, they read one chapter a night. By the time they've finished it, they've learned a lot about boxing. That was kind of how I was looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about, because Don, you said something exactly right. Like, guys probably about my age or younger, they know Money
Oh,
Mayweather. They know Mike Tyson, but probably from movies and other things more so than actual fights. But I know one thing when I watch fights over the last decade, I always hear, boxing's not the same as it used to be. It's not, you don't have these great heavyweights. You got these, you have great fighters and they're doing a good job, but it's not like the Ali and Frazier and all these big time moments. And I know you even talk about like the people that had impact on culture as a grander stage. But kind of just walk me through how you dug into, I guess, your kind of personal research and criteria on how you put this list together.
Well, it's funny when you talk about that. When I was a kid, you're a young man, and I was watching those characters like Ali and Larry Holmes and
Yeah.
Tyson. There were old guys around saying, "Oh, these guys aren't so great. They're not as good as Joe Louis or Rocky Marciano." So in a way, it's kind of like the fighters you watch when you're young. They really penetrate your mind. Yeah, they leave an impression, and anything that comes after that can't match up to what
Yeah.
was originally there when you were a kid. Same
It's
thing.
like Michael Jordan, LeBron James. If you were a Jordan fan, LeBron can't do anything.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the same with music. If you like
Yeah.
certain bands or performers when you were young, anybody who comes after that, they're
Not
not
as
going
good.
to match up. And it's hard to really maintain your interest and your enthusiasm if you're watching something like boxing. I mean, if you're watching it for 30 or 40 years, it does become difficult to appreciate everybody who comes along. Now, sometimes I have trouble, and I get paid to write about boxing. You know, sometimes I have trouble keeping up with all these new countries. Fighters coming out of countries that never participated in boxing. Sometimes that creates not a problem, but
Yeah.
you're seeing guys who maybe they competed at the Olympics in a communist country,
Yeah.
you know, and 40 years ago they couldn't turn pro, but now they can, and so you're seeing fighters from different parts of the world coming in, whereas boxing used to be almost primarily American, you know. So that has changed a lot just in my lifetime.
Yeah.
That when I was a kid, you could walk into any barber shop, any bar room, and you had nothing to talk about. You would just look at the guy next to you and say, "You going to watch the fight?"
Yeah.
And he knew what you were talking about. And back then, a heavyweight fight, I'm not exaggerating, a heavyweight fight was like a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
It was that big,
Yeah.
and they were on the main networks. So boxing just used to have a bigger stronghold on America, I think. And now it's universal, it's worldwide. England, it always amazes me. Like when I talk to British boxing fans or boxing writers from England, they're filling up football stadiums with their guys. And I'm always amazed by that. Trying to figure out when was the last time two American fighters filled up a football stadium.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. But
Yeah. Why do
now,
you think that is, Don? Because again, I when I watch certain fights, we've had some big ones over the last few years, but they kind of still they talk about just the difference it is now compared to those Super Bowl, style fights that everyone was talking about. What's your opinion on why that's changed a little bit in the popularity here specifically?
boy, we'd have to make this an hour long
Yeah.
podcast. I don't know if I could capsulize it into just a quick soundbite. But
Yeah.
part of it really is TV sponsors. That was a
Mm,
big part of it because around the late 80s, early 90s, uh, boxing started moving off of mainstream television and it started going into HBO and
yeah.
Showtime pay-per-view. And that was like the first thing that created a big shift. Now, if you wanted to watch boxing, you kind of had to search for it. You
Yeah.
know, it wasn't just on ABC, Wide World of Sports on Saturday afternoon, which
Yeah.
has been a staple for so many years. And suddenly it was almost exclusively on cable. And back then, not everybody had cable.
Yeah.
So it seems the audience started to dwindle. And the other thing that happened was there was a great influx of Mexican and Puerto Rican fighters, and the networks were hesitant because they thought, well, all of our viewers are, middle class, white bread America, you know, and these fighters, they can't speak English, they can't give interviews, they're not going to relate to the people at home, and that, whether that's true or not, I'm not saying,
Yeah.
but that was how the networks felt. So gradually, sponsors for things like motor oil and car commercials, and beer, those were the big three. They started backing off of boxing. So that was another thing that happened. And before you know it, I remember, in the 90s, people would say, whatever happened to boxing? You know,
Yeah.
or I'd tell them I was writing for a boxing magazine, and they'd say, does boxing still exist?
Yeah.
Who's the champion? Is Mike Tyson still the champion? What's going on? It was almost like a window had been closed, and just those two things: TV sponsors moving away, and then the fights all gravitating to cable. America lost half its audience, but the rest of the world didn't seem to lose interest.
Yeah.
It you know because in the 1990s, that's when British boxing really started to blossom. It had always been big, but suddenly they had a lot of big names like Lennox Lewis, Frank Bruno, and Nigel Benn. They had a lot of great names. That's kind of how it started. It was a snowball effect.
Yeah.
All you have to do
It's
is
certainly boxing has had its moments, though. I mean, I'm thinking the Manny Pacquiao Mayweather, just the whole build up for years. I think most people wish the fight would have happened earlier, but when they were both just a little bit younger and healthier. Because I just remember those years of build up. Everyone wanted it so bad. And I was thinking recently the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury fights. Those were some big heavyweight fights, with among my friend group that we were keeping up with, and a lot of guys that I know that didn't watch a lot of boxing, they looked forward to that fight,
that's how
or those
it always
fights.
was. That's how it always
Yeah,
was back in the day. You know,
yeah,
every heavyweight fight came along. Not every fight, but
yeah. But
the
I was kind of imagining, like, that's probably what it was like because I remember leading up to those fights, me and all my friends were like, "Dude, Saturday night, we're watching the Wilder Fury fight," you know?
yeah, the Pacquiao Mayweather fight was pretty unique. It was really unique. Um, that you had two guys of roughly the same size who were both so accomplished. That was kind of unique. That I think they were welterweights at that point. I mean, they both started out in lighter weight classes, but you had two welterweights generating that much interest. That
Yeah,
was really unique. And one of the guys being from the Philippines,
yeah.
that was unique.
And he was almost more likable than the hometown Mayweather, just from, like, a personality standpoint, the way they went about how
And
they carried themselves.
and his style was more exciting, and I think he had a lot of fans rooting for him.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, it happened a few years too late.
Yeah. But it kinda shows, like, how boxing can be when you've got the right people and the right fighters and the right, I guess, marketing behind these matchups. It's almost like we're craving more of it, we just haven't had a whole lot of it maybe. I don't know, I'm not in the space, but I know those are those moments where I remember, like, 2 specific fights where I was like, "Man, we gotta watch," and they were big deal.
And the other interesting thing too about Pacquiao and Mayweather was that they had both been in the business a long time.
Yeah,
They're both kind of past it when they
yeah,
fought. And when you think back to the great fights that I mentioned in my book, these fights didn't have 15 years of buildup. They didn't need it. You know what I mean? That's how different it was back then. You didn't need to, talk about something for 15 years to create
yeah,
interest. It was
yeah,
just a very different climate. And I don't want to sound like one of those guys who say, "Oh, it was better in the old days," but it was just a different setup, a different
yeah.
country. The media was different. A big
Well,
thing.
you didn't have crossover either. I mean, like the Conor McGregor Mayweather fight, UFC over to boxing, which drew a lot of views. It was different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was another weird thing. But one thing I noticed while I was working on the book was that New York played such a significant part in how certain fighters became, immortal, because New York was pretty much the center of it all. And if you were fighting in New York, you had all of the New York newspapers covering the event,
Yeah.
and so your name became really huge,
Mm,
and what I noticed about certain guys for a certain period in the last century, if they were not fighting in New York, they didn't become as well known.
mm,
It was almost like getting to Broadway or something.
yeah.
It's like that. They have a great record in California, but they just considered you, oh, he's a California
Matters.
fight. You know,
Yeah.
you really had to pull some strings to get to New York. So that was something that is kind of unique to the past. That's something that you can get from reading the book. You read about guys like Archie Moore who just on a Greyhound bus down south going
Yeah.
from one crappy arena to another,
Yeah.
um, and just waiting for the day to get to New York. He didn't get there till he was like 37, I think. He had his first fight in New York. So it was just a different time, different period, different set of circumstances for those guys. Did you get to read much of the book yet, or just
Yeah,
part?
so I've read quite a bit, but I was gonna ask you specifically, just as you were putting this together, what was there a couple things that you learned yourself where you were like, this is I didn't know this. I gotta put this in the book, like just stories about somebody in particular or any sort of, you kinda mentioned New York being the place you gotta go, but was there any inside, I guess, information you kind of found out and were like, wow, this is incredible?
Well, there was one character who was a lightweight in the 1930s or 20s, rather 20s, named, named Benny Leonard.
Okay.
Benny Leonard, and he was a very popular Jewish fighter, really considered a hero to a lot of the Jewish kids at that point, back in the 20s and early 30s. And what I learned about him, and I knew he was a great fighter, so there was really nothing new to learn there. But I didn't realize he was so involved with gamblers. Some of the biggest, most dangerous gamblers of the day were friends of his and would sort of goad him. They'd say, "I'm going to bet on you tonight by first round knockout. Can you pull it off?" And he would say, "Well, I'll try. You know, I'll give it a shot." And he would go out and he would try to KO guys in the first round just because he had buddies gambling on it.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
and I guess I was gonna ask that too, because 'cause you're talking about New York and like, I don't know, in my mind, I'm thinking, I see in movies like mob ties and, just these tough Italians, into boxing too. Like, I don't know, what was that like? I guess you just gave us an insight, gamblers and maybe some influence and kinda some underground workings. Kinda scary, actually.
well, a lot of the Italian mobster influence, it was prevalent from the 20s through the 50s. And there was an old saying, if you want to know which guys were involved with the mob, they were the ones who got title shots.
Mm,
That's that was a saying that went around boxing for a while.
yeah.
But and I don't know if that's true or if it was just said as kind of a joke. But one guy that I knew, he was a welterweight from Boston named Tony DeMarco. He fought in the 50s. And I got to know him when he was a much older man. Um, I would talk to him about the gangs, the gangland influence, and he put it in an interesting way. He said sometimes those guys would invest in a fighter instead of investing in a restaurant
Mm,
or a racehorse.
yeah.
It was something like a hobby. Put your money into it, see what happens. If the guy turns out to be no good, you pull your money out. You know, he said that went on pretty frequently, more so than fixing fights or any of that
Yeah.
stuff. It was, a lot of guys had mob ties, so to speak,
Yeah.
but it was really just some, you know, two bit mobster with a little bit of extra money. I'll invest in a middleweight, see what happens.
Yeah.
If he becomes the champ, I'll be able to make some money off of it. But I don't know if you remember Lou Duva. He might be a little before your time. He was a trainer. He trained a lot of guys like Evander Holyfield for a while and
Okay.
Hector Camacho, not Camacho, Pernell Whitaker. Trained a lot of guys in the 80s and 90s. Vinny Pazienza. But I was talking to Lou Duva about the old gangster days, and he said back then if you wore a suit and a tie, people thought you were a gangster. So a
Yeah.
lot of it was exaggerated. Here's a guy with a suit and a tie coming to the gym. Oh, he's got to be a gangster.
Yeah.
And so he kind of played it down too. But there's no doubt that there was some gangland influence. There was a big trial in the early '60s before the Congress,
Mhm.
where uh, a couple of guys were sent to jail, uh,
Mhm.
legal
Yeah.
shenanigans with fights, and that's where Jake LaMotta, the Raging Bull, testified, saying that yeah, I took a dive in a fight, against Billy Fox, because they said I would get a title shot if I put this guy over. So there was definitely some gangland influence. That fortunately, the guys that I wrote about through maybe just a fluke, they weren't really too touched by any of that. I'm sure they knew stuff that was going on,
Yeah.
but there were always guys who were untouchable in a way. Some fighters were so good and so polished and so respected that
Yeah.
that even the criminals would say, "I don't mess with him.
Yeah.
He's untouchable. We shouldn't get involved." You know, but so it was more likely on the lower end of things.
Yeah.
Those guys
It's
were,
just interesting the culture of boxing and just how much is involved there. And then you just get into the style of fight from different boxers and just their personas and just some of them larger than life characters. And again, I'm kind of like thinking of Mike Tyson and just like, man, that's a bad dude. Like you're saying, nobody wants to cross that guy in an alley, or get on his bad side. But I'm sure a lot of these guys were like that. But it's just each fighter had their own, like I said, aura or personality to them, and just the way they carried themselves. But the whole culture of boxing in general is just so fascinating.
yeah. One thing I noticed about these guys, I picked out 15 for the front of the book,
Yeah,
the main 15, and then there's an honorable mention list at the back of the book. And I was thinking, as I was writing it, if I had written this book 20 years ago, I don't know if Tyson would have made the cut. That
it's
sounds odd.
interesting.
That
It's
sounds
interesting you say that. Yeah,
I know to younger fans that probably sounds odd, but if you think back to the end of his career, he was not so well regarded. He was
Yeah.
he becomes sort of a foolish character, you know. He was losing fights, He lost a bunch.
thanks, Lewis.
Yeah, lost a bunch of guys near the end of his career, and he was not so highly regarded. And I even remember when he finally retired in like 2005 or 2006 or whenever it was, my editor at the Ring magazine said, "Why don't you write a story about whether or not he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame?" And that's at the time that was a topic. Does he really belong in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah.
With all of the disgrace that he brought on himself, he was at the time people thought of him as an underachiever. He could have been one of the greats, but in that little time frame, people thought of him as an underachiever. What could have been, you know? But now, writing this book 20 years later, his image has grown so much. He's bigger now than he ever was. And I'm thinking, well, now, yeah, he's kind of morphed into one of the immortals, you know. But 20 years ago, it was, I don't know if he would have made the cut. He might have been an
Yeah.
honorable mention, you know. And it's funny, that's what happens with a lot of fighters. They grow in retrospect, you know. You'll only remember the good times, you know.
Well, he's done such a good job of putting his face out there in a positive way, and then you think back on his peak of his career when he did have the punch and the wins, and it was just people look up the highlights and they're like, "Wow, he was deadly." But then you also remember the biting of the ear and all these crazy things.
And now they remember that in a positive light.
Yeah,
Back then he was like the biggest fool you'd ever seen. People really didn't like him anymore. They just thought he was a coward, and he wasn't going to win, so he fouled out. Now they look at that as like, oh, he's crazy.
yeah,
He's just crazy.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they,
They go, "That's awesome."
yeah, yeah, yeah. You can put a spin on it that way. Oh, that's Mike. He's nuts, man. He's a madman.
Yeah.
But back then, when he actually bit Holyfield, it was considered a travesty,
Yeah.
So time really kind of changes things, and that's how it goes. That's how it's always been. And in a way, what Tyson has done, like you said, is that he's made himself visible. He didn't let us forget him. He kind of pops up, in different places, like a
Yeah.
whack-a-mole, you know,
Yeah. There'll
and
be a movie over here, at the mall over here, this event.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He's in Saudi Arabia. He's doing this.
Yeah.
He's at a charity event or hosting his own podcast. You
Yeah.
know, he's appearing in a movie once in a while.
Yeah.
He's been really good at marketing himself.
Yeah.
Better than a lot of his predecessors. Because a lot of them, once their careers were over, they kind of faded. And you didn't, even the really great ones like Joe Louis and Ray Robinson, who were there's greatness and then there's greatness, you know,
Yeah.
and Lewis and Robinson were way up there. But in their later lives, they really kind of folded in half almost, you know, and they were just kind of, you know, almost sad little figures, you know, especially Lewis, you know, he ended up in Las Vegas working as a greeter at one of the casinos, you know, and became very sick. And it's not like he could have fought, you know, Jake Paul for millions of dollars, you know,
Yeah.
even for laughs. He couldn't have done that. He was just, you know, poor health, financially strapped.
Yeah.
Ray Robinson too ended up broke and in bad health, and so in a way, that's where Tyson has surpassed a lot of his own heroes in that he's kind of stayed relevant, um, kind of kept his head out there.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, kind of interesting.
Do you, Don, and I know you put this list together kind of looking at a lot of different factors, but do you have, if it's different than the book, do you have a Mount Rushmore of your personal top 3 or 4 boxers of all time?
Well, there were guys that I had to cut, and like I said earlier, I'm glad I didn't have to do Mexican fighters because I love Mexican fighters. I think
Yeah.
they're great. They have a long tradition, probably as long as any other country. Uh, my Mount Rushmore, it would be some of the guys in this book. I couldn't. I don't think I could just pick 4 from Mount
Yeah.
Rushmore, but you know, I would put, you know, like this Jack Dempsey, heavyweight champion from the 1920s. To me, he's vital because uh, he became such a symbol, such an important sports figure. He was up there at the time. He was up there with Babe Ruth, and in football, I guess it was Red Grange. Dempsey was a phenomenon, and he didn't have to fight that often. That was the strange thing. Was once he won the championship, he was so popular, so over the top. He only had to fight like once a year, once every 18 months. As a result, he kind of got rusty. And, you know, then he took some time off and he went to Hollywood and made some bad movies. And he fascinates me, one, because he had this kind of ruthless style. And the other thing is that this was the early days of when they were filming fights and they would show them at movie theaters,
Mm.
you know, a couple of weeks after the fact. So you had read about the fight in the newspaper, and then you would say, "Oh, it's playing at my local cinema. I'm going to go see it." And that was how the whole country kind of fell in love with Jack Dempsey. You
Mm.
know, what was just seeing him, this larger than life character on a big movie screen. Because back then, movie theaters were enormous,
Yeah.
and they were even called movie palaces. That's how elaborate they were. And so I'm intrigued, sometimes not just by the fighter, but how the media is able to
Yeah.
put him over, you know. And same thing with another early guy in the book, but I got to give some credit to John L. Sullivan. He was the bridge between bare knuckle boxing and glove boxing. Really interesting character because at the time they were still fighting under what they used to call the London rules, which were slightly different. And you could basically poke a guy's eyes out. You could, you know, anything short of stabbing him. It was just a nasty sport, and it was illegal in most states. And a lot of your fights would get broken up by the police. But Sullivan was smart. Once he got into the business, he just thought, when you're fighting bare knuckle, you hurt your hands. That was the
Yeah.
main. And he wanted to fight a lot, you know, so he could make more money, you know. And so he adopted the idea. He didn't invent gloves, but he was one of the first to say, "Give me the gloves. I'll
Right.
fight with those little mittens," you know, because they protected his hands and he could fight in different cities, you know. And it was he was almost like a rock star on tour, really. Like he'd get on a train with his posse of sparring partners and they would hit, you know, they'd hit Boston, they'd hit, you know, Maine, they hit New York, they'd hit 4 or 5 places in the Midwest, you know, and they would travel the whole country. He couldn't do that bare knuckle, but with the gloves, he could do it. And fighting under the newly developed Martyrs of Queensberry rules, which were a little more humane, which is pretty much what they use now, fighting with the gloves, fighting with better rules, he was able to make a lot more money than anyone ever had before. And the fact that he was traveling, it became uh, this bigger than life character coming to your town. Like I
Yeah.
said, the rock star on tour. And what was interesting too was that this was the beginning of the telegraph. So rather than, going to your phone to see what was going on, trying to get news updates or whatever, or going online to learn stuff, the telegraph was sending reports of his latest fight to the newspaper offices around the country. And it became kind of a ritual for the boxing fans in that city or town to kind of congregate at the newspaper office, you
And
know,
wait for the news.
waiting for the news,
Wow.
and a guy and they said that they would actually make a production out of it. There would be a guy in the newsroom, like a megaphone, shouting out the results. Sullivan won the first round. And the guys outside, yeah, and they would serve beer on the sidewalk outside the newsroom, and it became an event. Before you had pay per view. Was again that kind of thing is fascinating. Not just that Sullivan was this strong guy who knocked opponents out, but the way the media was able to enhance his
Yeah.
legend.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. No, this is Don, this has been so interesting because there's so much in here. Just again, I guess I call myself a casual boxing fan. I know things that interest me, but there's so many things like you just shared, the stories of how people even got results and just the whole reasoning behind putting gloves on, so you can fight more, make more money. Like there's just all these little details that are just so interesting and fascinating to learn. And each of these guys having their own sort of piece to the history of boxing and their own influence on it. And they've left their mark one way or another. Just an incredible, incredible book that I'm going to be flipping through it for days and weeks. It's one I'll probably go back to and kind of look through because it's just so much fun. But I know a lot of friends of mine too are going to find this extremely fascinating and interesting.
Well, I
It's
hope
very cool.
I hope so because you call yourself a casual fan, and I think that is what boxing misses, just
Yeah.
casual fans. It seems like it only has hardcore fans now.
Yeah.
Guys who are just so into it. Uh, that the casual fan. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's
No. That's a
awesome.
great point because all these sports, football, basketball, you have so many casual fans. They go once in a while or they watch when their friends are watching. In boxing, you're right. Boxing's missing that to where there's a bigger audience to consume this. It's
Well,
had its moments, but you're right. There's room to improve and to grab us more often. And I hope they do because I've loved all the fights that I watch and I love the people.
oh, sure. See, there was this rule of thumb that I had to judge a fighter's popularity when I was writing the book. I would think back to when I was a kid. And if my mother knew who the fighter was,
It
I
was
would
a
think,
big
"Oh,
deal.
he had crossed over, right? He had somehow crossed over into the mainstream, you know.
Yeah.
And there were guys back then, who they fought on television often enough, or they got their name in the newspaper often
Yeah.
enough. My mother would kind of know who they were.
Yeah. Amazing.
And that was kind of a little rule I had. It's like, all right, if there was somebody I was thinking of, if there was a fighter I wanted to include, I would think back, would my mother have known him? Then I would think, no, she wouldn't have known like Tommy Hearns. Okay. She would not have known Tommy Hearns, but she would have known Sugar Ray Leonard. That was the difference between fighters who really crossed over into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And to me that counts. There you'll find fans who just think that that's fluff, but to me it counts because
Yeah.
it keeps the wheels spinning in
Yeah.
boxing. You know what I mean? It's the grease that keeps the engine going.
Yeah.
You know.
No, I think that's a very fair metric. Very fair.
Did you have other questions or anything that you
No,
wanted?
I was just again, Don, this is awesome. I don't want you to give too much away because I want people to read your book and look through it because it is incredible. There's so many amazing stories. And again, I was looking through and I was sitting there thinking, like,
Yep.
yeah, it's so many moments that are captured in there.
It's like that make it it's a good book to have. And it's not that expensive, really. For a book like this, slick pages and a lot of photographs. It's only like 20. I think the full price is like $26.95, but
Yeah.
Amazon knocks a couple of bucks off of that, depending on the
Yeah.
week or the month or whatever. But
No, it's a great gift for a birthday or Father's Day coming up or anything like that. It's amazing. But Don, where can people find you if they want to see, if they want to dig deeper into this work or your other work?
well, I write for the Ring magazine. I had a couple of stories in there every month. And here's the latest issue of the Ring. This is a beautiful. It's got that's Tyson Fury on the cover.
Yeah, we were talking about them.
Yep. And, the Ring is it's a beautiful magazine too. It's full color. It's got
Awesome.
a lot of interesting articles in there. I do about 2 stories a month for the Ring. And I've been with the Ring for about 20 years, maybe 21 years, and I've been fortunate that they have occasional changes in management. They've always kept me on the team, so I'm grateful for that. But and I'm on Twitter, though I don't usually do much lately, or X as it's called now. I'm not a big social media guy. I don't love it, And a lot of times I'll try to get on it, and I think I'm just kind of wasting my time,
Yeah.
But I also write a lot of true crime stuff. I have some true crime books that are coming out in the next
Yeah.
6 or 8 months. So I'm
Yeah.
pretty busy. I have a lot of different things going on, and
No.
they can go to my Amazon page too. Look me up on
Yeah.
Amazon. Don Stradley. Just go to Amazon and put my name in the search, and you'll see a bunch of books that I've written. I wrote one called The War, which was about the Marvin Hagler Tommy Hearns fight. And that's a book that a lot of people like. So if you're interested in those guys, I'd recommend that book. If you if you like the Immortals and you want to read more from me, I'd recommend The War about the Hagler Hearns fight, and you
Okay.
can find it
Yeah.
on it.
No, perfect, and we'll make sure that we've already got this book on the Books for Guys website. We'll get that book and all of yours posted on there as well, obviously with links to Amazon so anyone
Oh,
can
sure.
find your work and all of that. But no, Don, this has been awesome, man. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Chris.